So what do you think is responsible for how well you did at school? So it's easy to think about tangible environmental factors like your parents, your teachers, your schools. But what I'd like to convince you is that something intangible, DNA, is the major factor responsible for differences between children in their performance at school. The environment's important too, but the way it works is very different from the way we thought it worked before we took genetics into account. Previous studies of the environment are confounded because things that run in families could run in families for reasons of nature, genetics, as well as nurture. But if you ignore the nature and assume everything's nurture, you make some very wrong conclusions about the environmental influences on behavior. Identifying specific DNA differences that account for differences in behavior. And that's what's going to change everything. You know, genetics, heritability, these are difficult concepts for people to grasp, but when you ask people, how heritable is eye color? That is, how much is it due to inherited DNA differences? I've done these surveys, and people, on average, would say it's about 90% heritable. That means it's almost entirely due to inherited DNA differences. But when you turn to complex traits like weight, how heritable do you think weight is? People would say about 20%, 30%. They think there might be some genetic influence, but it's mostly environmental. But in fact, it's 70% heritable across a wide range of studies, including DNA studies. And that's really important because, you know, it means of the differences between people in this room, you all seem to be skinny, except for me. The differences are substantial, but the major factor is inherited DNA differences, which is really important in our society with fat blaming and, you know, fat shaming, the sorts of stuff that goes on. And to recognize people like me find it a lot easier to put on weight than you skinny people, and a lot harder to lose weight. So when you turn to school achievement, though, people underestimate genetic influence even more. They think it's about maybe a little bit of genetic influence, but not much, because achievement is the means, the etymology of it is by dint of effort, as opposed to ability, which people say, oh, that's genetic. But in fact, school achievement, tested school achievement in English, in schools in England, is about 60% heritable. Meaning 60% of the differences between kids in their tested school achievement is due to inherited DNA differences. And you can see how important it is to know that, because we tend to assume it's all environmental. It's all due to how good a school you went to, how much your parents push you on this. But parents don't have nearly as much control as they think they do. So that's one of the messages I want to get to. The most misunderstood concept in genetics is heritability, these 6 syllables. And so it's important just to spend a minute talking about it. We're only talking about what makes people different, why some of us are heavier than others, why some of us do better at school than others. Of our 3 billion base pairs of DNA in the double helix of DNA, more than 99% of those DNA bases are the same for everybody. But 1% differs. And we're asked, the 99% is what makes us human, but the 1% is what makes us different genetically. So what we're asking is, to what extent does the 1% of DNA that differs between us make us different in traits like school achievement? We're only talking about describing what is rather than what could be. So we study like twins and adoptees and DNA in a representative English sample. But that only tells us about what is now. Say in terms of weight, given our genetic differences and our environmental differences now, how much do genetic differences make a difference? If you change the environment, if you study a different population in a different time, that would change. But that's a good descriptive statistic that is sensitive to the environment in which you study it. And we're only describing the normal range of variation. I'm sure it's an issue you all face, that you can only talk about, you can't generalize beyond the sample that you've described. So these samples that we study are maybe representative of 95% of the population, but they don't include, say, families where parents are abusing the kids, because those people don't participate in studies. Nor does it include the genetic extremes of single gene mutations that are very severe and debilitating, but they're very, very rare. 1 in 100,000, 1 in 200,000. So if you have a sample of a few tens of thousands of people, you don't have those in the sample. And lastly, I want to emphasize we're talking about genetic influences. These are nudges, probabilistic propensities. They're not innate. They're not immutable and they're not deterministic. Those are really important points. And people, you scratch the surface of what people know about genetics and they somehow think you're talking about innate, immutable influences, which is the case for single gene disorders, which is how most of us learn about genetics from Mendel. You know, there are thousands of single gene disorders. As I say, they're very rare. But if you have the gene on chromosome 4, the form of a gene called an allele for Huntington's disease, you will die from Huntington's. It's hardwired, deterministic. It doesn't matter what your environment is or anything else. The problem is when we talk about complex traits, not just psychological traits, but most of the medical burden in society is caused by common disorders. And they're not caused by single genes. They're influenced genetically, but by many, many genes of small effect. That makes them probabilistic rather than deterministic. And that's a really difficult jump for people to make.